Good evening, everyone. Want to welcome you to our midweek Bible study. We do look thin tonight. I wish I looked a lot thinner than I do, but I mean thin in our number tonight. We have a load of people over there in the activity building. The Common Ground people are here. The kids from Common Ground are here. And the college group and the teen group are over there, and they're feeding them and having a devotional with them to kind of get them oriented. Hope that they'll want to come here often or come back, but they have to get a ride here. So they're over there doing something with them in just a few minutes. I'll be heading over there to do the Devo. So tonight, Chris has the invitation tonight. John's got the song service. And Ben, if you will, dismiss the classes, if you don't mind. Announcements. Sick that we have. Went to see Miss Pat today. She's ran a low grade of fever earlier in the week, but is seemed to be feeling a little better this evening, but had a rough week. So just keep her in your prayers. Jane Doyle has been in the hospital since Sunday afternoon. I think they carried her Sunday. And I thought she was going to come home today, but I tried to call and I didn't get through yet. But she has a UTI and a kidney infection, and it was pretty severe. So she was feeling a lot better, but just yesterday was hoping to come home, but I didn't hear that for sure. So just remember her in your prayers. That's all that I have of sick. We have our VBS planning meeting coming up on March 30th. That will be more said about that. Jess will say more about that later. The teens will have SAYS, Shows Area Youth Series, next Sunday night. So parents, they'll be over there for that. And the chorus is out as well, Marshall Chorus. A lot of our families are gone with that. They're at Cross Point tonight. And Pack-A-Pew, that is our big day. We have been announcing it for a little while now. It is coming up the first Sunday in April. We have a meal. We do it in the activity building. We have an afternoon service that day. It's a pretty big day. Most churches have Friends and Family Day or Homecoming. That's what this is for us. It's all that rolled into one. So our Pack-A-Pew is our big service of the year. We'll have several visitors here. So please, be inviting people if you can. Invite your neighbors, your friends, your family. And we'll have some cards in the back by the end of the week that you can take home and jot a little note down and put them in the mail. Work day on the 29th. We're going to have a work day here on the 29th. Yeah, if it rains, we'll do some things inside, and I'll postpone it to the next. Okay, last Saturday of the month, the 29th, we will have work day here at the building, getting ready for that. We've got some things to do outside, not as much as we usually have to do because we've done a lot of last year or so. So if you can come out for that, we'll say more about that later. Just to give you something for the future, Barry handed me this tonight. I'll put it up on the sign. I'll put it on the bulletin board tonight. But it's Florence Boulevard is doing a Men's Mental Health Day. I've never heard of that before, but that sounds awesome. Moving Your Mountains. It will be June 14th from 9 to 2. So that's a little later on in the year, but we want to make sure we announce that and get that known, and so we can have maybe a good turnout for that. And I want to say thank you to all of those that attended the one worship. I think that went great. I think there was a good number. The singing was phenomenal, and just had a good vibe of the church, knowing that we're doing great. The church is doing great in this area, and we're trying to show that unified front, and it was a great time. I'm sure this is going to be something that they do once a year and try to grow it as much as they can. All right, I think that is it tonight. So as I mentioned, John's got our song service and Chris has the invitation. So let's all stand for the first song.
Jesus our God.
Be seated.
Master, the tempest is raging, the billows are tossing high. The sky is overshadowed with blackness, no shelter or help this night. Carest thou not me that we perish? How canst thou lie asleep? When moments so rapidly are spreading, a great and the angry King, who wins and who will shall obey thy will. Peace, be still. Whether the wrath of the storm doth see, or demons or men, or whatever it be, no water can swallow the ship where lies the Master of ocean and earth and skies. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace, be still. Peace, be still. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace, peace, be still. Master, the terror is over, the elements seem to rest. The sun doth come like its nearer, and heaven's within my breast. Finger of blessed Redeemer, Lady alone will hold. And with joy I shall make the blessed harbor, and rest on the blissful shore. Who wins and who will shall obey thy will. Peace, be still. Whether the wrath of the storm doth see, or demons or men, or whatever it be, no water can swallow the ship where lies the Master of ocean and earth and skies. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace, be still. Peace, be still. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace, peace, be still.
If you would go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 4. We'll look at that here in a second. Mark chapter 4. John Paul, you did good with the songs. I gave him a verse and he always comes through. This afternoon when I was coming home from work, I was coming across the bridge and it was really windy. You all probably noticed that. I was really shocked when I came out of the office and I looked down across the river and it was kind of white-capping. You had a lot of waves that were coming through and at the same time I'm thinking, well, what am I going to talk about tonight? And it hit me. So when I was about 8 or 9 years old, my granddad and I decided that we were going to go down to Waterloo and we were going to get out on the river on our boat. Well, let me describe what our boat was. It was, if you look it up on bassproshop.com, I think it's called like a pond prowler. Davey probably knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's 10 foot long and it has 2 seats, and you put the seats in, one in front of the other, and it has a 10-mile-per-hour trolling motor on the back. That was the boat. So we went down to Waterloo and we actually physically picked the boat up, put it in the back of an S10 pickup. It weighed about 100 pounds and went all the way down there. So we're out, we're going along, everything's great. Again, I'm 8 years old. I think that we've got, a speedboat here. So we're driving around, in the boat, and I said, I want to go out a little bit further. I want to go out where the bigger boats are. My granddad says, sure, we'll go out there. So it takes us forever, and we get out there. And all of a sudden, some of the bigger boats come by and almost capsized us. And at that point, I'm thinking, we have really messed up. Even at 8 years old, of course, I was like, we have really messed up because I was so, mature at that age. So I said, can we please go back and, get to shore and let's just stop because I've had enough. Well, by the time we get close to shore, another boat comes by. This time we really do almost capsize. And I don't remember saying this, but my granddad said, I said something along the lines of, "People, are you not embarrassed by this boat here?" And I've always felt bad about that. But anyway, it got me to thinking today of the story in Mark chapter 4. And we all know the story very well. This is whenever Jesus calms the storm. And starting in verse 35, it says, "On that day, when evening it came, he said to them, 'Let's go over to the other side,' leaving the crowd. And they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was. And the other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so much that the boat was already filling up. And Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep. And they woke him, and they said, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And he got up and rebuked the wind, and he said to the sea, 'Hush, and be still.' And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them," and listen to this part, "and he said to them, 'Why are you afraid? Do you not still have no faith?'" You know, a lot of times when we read that story, we think about the physical parts of life, the physical things that you go through. And maybe it's God's providence, with Mental Health Day. I want to look at it from a little bit of a different perspective, because in my opinion, I think that a lot of the issues that we go through nowadays are not physical, although there's many. A lot of it is mental. A lot of it are things that nobody else can see. There are things that I go through that you have no idea that I go through. There are things that you go through that none of us know. So I want us to look at 3 different things tonight that hopefully can help us be a little bit closer to Jesus during those times whenever maybe we're not as mentally strong or maybe we're a little bit down. Number one, to combat the mental storms in our life, we can shut off the illusions in our minds. If you look, Proverbs 23:7, and we won't turn there, I'll just read it. "For as a man thinks within himself, so is he." One of the elements or the things that I've written in my Bible next to that verse says, just because the thought exists doesn't mean that it's true. So how often have we been in that situation to where you've thought, oh no, something is going to happen tomorrow, the next day, or whatever, and whatever that thought is really robs you of today's joys? I think that all of us can say that, correct? Yeah. There's plenty of times in our lives to where we sit there and we worry about what ifs, what might happen, instead of trying to live where our feet are, just living for today, because we know we're not promised tomorrow, and we know in the Bible it tells us not to worry, but we continue to do that. One of the things that I've looked up here recently is called metacognition. Ronnie, you may be able to tell us about all of this, but it's basically the idea of being mindful of what you think. So whenever the thought comes in your head, well, I'm really worried about X, or I'm worried about Y, I'm worried about what's going to happen tomorrow, or what if this bad thing happens to me? What am I going to do? Instead of focusing on what am I doing right now? All right, number 2. Put your trust in the right person. Now, we all know who that person is. Let's turn over one more chapter in Mark and look at Mark chapter 5. And this is within verses 25 through 34, but we're just going to hit a few verses here and there. Let's look at verses 27 and 28. "And after hearing about Jesus, she came in the crowd from behind him and touched his cloak." Remember this, "For she thought, if I could just touch his garments, I will get well." All right, now let's look at verse 31 through 34. Looking at the end of 31, Jesus said, "Who touched me?" And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." So, one of the devotionals that I was reading here over the past few weeks, one of the quotes in it was really simple. You either trust God, trust Jesus, or you don't. It really is that simple. Do you trust him or do you not? When you pray, do you pray thinking, well, I'm going to pray for that, but you know what? I mean, I just don't see how it's going to happen. Or do you really put your trust in him to know, I'm praying for this, and if it is God's will, it's going to happen? Because go back to verse 28. Maybe it was 28. If I can just touch his garments, I will get well. She didn't say, well, you know what, if I could just touch his garment. I think I've heard that he's healed people before. I might can get healed. I might have a chance. Or if I could just touch his garment, maybe he would look and talk to me and maybe something will happen. Maybe. No. She had faith. She trusted that if she acted, that Jesus would react. All right, and the third part is, this is the tough one, stop worrying. It's easier said than done, isn't it? I mean, even if the Bible tells us, do not worry, it's a lot easier said than done. Another quote that I've got that I've written down, I like to write in my Bible, it says, worry replaced by prayer equals the peace of God. Now, as we turn over to our last passage, Philippians 4, 6 through 8, this is not one of those magical things, and I hope you hear me correctly on this. Just because you pray to not worry doesn't mean that it's just automatically magic is going to happen. I can tell you that we all have walked in this life long enough to know that it takes a lot of action. It takes a lot of time to be able to work on your faith, to work on your trust, and to not worry, but to trust in God. And here we see that in Philippians. Starting in verse 6, it says, be anxious or worry about nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Jesus Christ. Basically, let go and let God. It's an easy saying, but do we really believe it? And it's not going to be one of those things to where you believe it right now, and if you believe it now and you have faith in it, that it's just going to be easy the rest of your life. No. It's going to be a daily, an hourly, a minute-by-minute thing that you have to put your trust in God. That's the only way that it's going to work. I think that this is an easy lesson tonight, but I think it's one that we all know the answers to, but yet I think that we would all admit that we all struggle in these areas, right? And maybe it's not something that we're really comfortable talking about, but I think that it's something that if it's on my mind, I'm sure it's been on y'all's as well. So tonight, if you've been struggling, from a mental state, if you've been struggling from some of the storms that are going on in your life, whether they're physical, whether they're mental, whatever it is, if you're subject to the invitation, please come now as John Paul leads us in song.
Hear the sweet voice of Jesus say, come unto me, I am the way. Hearken the love being called away. Come for he loves to do so. Only a step, only a step. Come for he bled for you and I. He's the same love.
Let's bow. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again for allowing us to be here tonight. We're grateful for the opportunity to come here and to be strengthened and to lift you up, Father, and to remind ourselves of our main purpose in this life. Father, we pray that you will be with those that are sick right now and those who are ailing. Please be with them and their health. Give them strength, Father. Be with those that are ministering to them and taking care of them and watch over them. Father, we pray that you'll be with us and strengthen us as we prepare for the second half of this week. Father, help us to grow as Christians, to grow closer to you and closer to each other. We thank you for your Son and his sacrifice and the promise we have of heaven. It's in his name we pray. Amen.
There we go. Well, it's good to be here. Good to have this number with us as we continue to study. We're in Romans chapter 12, looking at the latter part of verse 20. I think that's what I've got. Yeah. Last week, as we ended, we were talking about this idea of heaping coals on the head of people that do something to us. And as I was saying then, I found three different interpretations of that, and since I've found a bunch more, but I think we can get the gist of it. In pouring coals on people's head, first it said at some point, in Bible lands, people carried containers on their head. If their enemy's fire went out and was looking for someone was looking to some coals to restart that fire, then it would be a generous gesture for us to give them some. And they would put that coal on their head in their container, whatever it happened to be. Of course, you'd have to have an enemy whose fire went out, and you'd have to have the coal, and they'd have to have all the coal. And of course, that would necessarily be something that we have to recognize by what this particular verse is saying. It's not saying that we want to hurt someone, but if they're doing us wrong, if we do good to them, that it's going to be as if we were pouring coals on their head. Other writers refer to an Egyptian ritual in which a man testifies publicly to his penitence by carrying a pan of hot burning coal around on his head. That may very well be true too. But this Jimmy Allen, who I'm sure most of us have heard of, says that it's probably the best one. That is, he pointed out that when enemies stormed a city, the inhabitants of the city defended the wall by dropping things on the heads of the invaders, including burning coals. He suggested that Paul's words mean that the best defense against evil is doing good. Now, again, I found a couple of verses in Psalms that use this particular idea, and I'll let you look those up. But the thing seems to be that we're not trying to hurt the person. We're trying to really put them to shame. If they're doing things that are bad for us and we do something good for them, it's going to be very effective to let them know that we're not trying to get even with them or anything like that, but we are trying to show that we have the kind of personality and the kind of religion that would cause us to do good even to people who are doing us bad. We know that we mistreat God. We have and we will. And we know that He is going to forgive us of these things. In Romans chapter 5, way back there in verses 8 and 9, it says, "But God commendeth His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, being now justified by His blood, we shall be saved shall be saved from the wrath through Him." So we offend God, and He doesn't, what you might say, take it out on us. He still loves us. He still provides the Savior for us, and we want to take advantage of that. And you know, if we know that God's doing good for us when we're doing bad toward Him, that kind of gives us that feeling of being in the wrong, most certainly. In 1 John chapter 4 at verse 19, we love Him, that is God, because He first loved us. So we know that here Paul is not necessarily talking about, trying to get back at somebody, and I don't think that's what he's meaning at all. But he's simply saying, even to those who mistreat us, treat them well, and we could win them over. In verse 21, he says, "Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good." Now, of course, that is exactly what we're talking about there in heaping the coals on them. The first part of that, be not overcome with evil, it means that we want to be victorious over evil. We want to conquer evil, and the Greek shows us that. We're supposed to overcome evil with good. Not easy, but it is possible. By having a strength in God and a confidence in God, we can forgive people that are doing us wrong. We can overcome evil things, even in our own lives. Just as we are not to repay evil for evil, God does not want us to overcome evil with evil. He wants us to overcome the evil by doing good. Fighting back makes the matter even worse. Because if we're fighting back with someone, then of course that means that there's going to be even harder hearts to straighten out. And if we do wrong to someone, it does harden their hearts against us. I was watching a television show while I was eating lunch today, and the policeman was asking this man that they had apprehended if he was resisting. He said, "I never resisted." And he said, "Well, why then, when we took you out of the car, you fought with us 20 feet away from the car?" If you weren't resisting, it looks like you would have just been standing there. But the idea is that sometimes that's what we do. We resist, and we sometimes don't know that we're resisting. We're just maybe sometimes trying to rationalize it with our own minds that, I know why I did this, and I should have not have, but it looks good, and I think it was good, and we get all bent out of shape. In Luke chapter 23 at verse 34, it says, "And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they parted his raiment and cast lots." This is even when Jesus was on the cross. He was forgiving them, even as they, there at the foot of the cross, were in a sense rolling dice to see who got his garment. So, if Christians seek with their own hands to take vengeance, which we've already noted from what comes first in this chapter, that vengeance is God's, he's going to take care of these things. He himself, we will become evil ourselves if we try to take vengeance. Because most of the time, if we're like most people, if you hit me once, I'll probably hit you twice. I'm going to try to outdo you, and that's not a good thing to do at all. By obeying God, we can overcome evil. Chapter 12 has been called the Little Bible because it gives so many characteristics of the Christian life. And not only the chapter 12, but the whole rest of the Bible, the rest of Romans, lets us know how we can live and do that which God would have us to do and be pleasing to God in that. That moves us to chapter 13. And we know that chapter 13 is a great chapter on those things of government. In chapter 13, Paul continues to discuss, of course, what it means to live the Christian life, but he emphasizes about three things. That is, we are to submit to the government by obeying its laws and paying its taxes. That's the first 7 verses. Then verses 8 through 10, they underscore the importance of loving one's neighbor. And then the last part of it, 11 through 14, at the end of the chapter, Paul is providing a summary of the proper Christian conduct, calling for vigilance, for us to watch what we're doing, be careful, because things are going to happen. So in this first 7 verses, and we probably won't get farther than that tonight, we're going to be looking at government. And Jesus has a lot to say about government, as does Paul. He says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." Or let every soul submit to the government, the higher powers, those authorities. We notice that the Phillips translation says civil authorities rather than higher powers. And that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the government. Many of the Jews in Paul's day advocated Jewish independence. The Jews, even by their own admission or talking, they would say, we have never been under the power of anyone. We have never been subject to anyone except the Jewish authorities. And of course, they forget very quickly that they had, for no time at all, I guess, from times immemorial, had been under somebody. There's several kingdoms that had taken them over, and now they were under Rome. So how could they say such a thing? Of course, they did desire to get out from the Roman yoke. They wanted the Romans gone. They were looking for a Messiah that was going to take care of that. He was going to get these Romans, to hit the road, and they were going to set up the great kingdom again. But we know that hadn't come. They wanted their freedom politically, and as we all do, and we know that they were even, John 6:15, trying to get Jesus to be king. Jesus removed himself from the situation there. He went somewhere else because he knew that they wanted to make him a king. And what a wonderful king he would have made. They could only see him providing food miraculous for the armies. That's one of the biggest problems we have with armies. Some of the armies in that day would completely burn off all of the fields of the people they were going to fight because they wouldn't have anything to eat. But Jesus could miraculously do that. We know, too, that civil disturbances were always common among the Jews. They were not a calm people. In Romans, it said these disturbances were caused many times by what the government did. In Acts chapter 8 at verse 2, notice what happened here. It says, "And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them." So we see here that Paul found Apollos and his wife, Aquila and Priscilla, and we find that they had been thrown out of Rome because the leader, the Caesar, had said he wanted all Jews out of Rome. He just didn't like them, so he cast them out. We know that many times there were things that were done to the Jews that were not good. Two insurrections are mentioned specifically in the book of Luke and Acts. In Luke 23, it says, "And they all cried together, 'Away with this man, Jesus, give us Barabbas.'" Now notice this man, a man who had been thrown in prison for an insurrection started in the city and a murder. So here Barabbas was leading an insurrection against the Romans right there in Jerusalem where they were. And then we notice also in Acts chapter 5 at verse 36, it mentions a man named Theudas. It says he rose up claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all of that followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. So there were political problems, and there were political people trying to take over the government and do this, that, or the other. But we know that most Christians, I think this is true, I think it's very wise to say it, we want to obey the laws. We need to obey the laws, as long as they do not conflict with what God says. We recognize that the binding duties of both earthly citizenship and heavenly citizenship. We have God, our King, but we also have, in our country, a president and the Senate and House of Representatives. All these people are giving us laws that we have to follow, and they can back it up with the power of government. Paul has just shown that Christians here are to love their enemies and to return good for evil, not take vengeance into their own hands. And now he shows how God's vengeance is carried out on the earth. He's going to talk about the powers that be. And I think we understand that, but he gives some good things about it. Every Christian is to submit to the higher powers, meaning the government, the civil rule that we're under. We obey them. We understand that God has ordained those governments. The Bible tells us that. In Daniel chapter 2 at verse 21, it said, "And he changeth the times and the seasons," that is God. "He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom to the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding." So if we read that, we notice that God is the one that puts kings in office, and he's the one that takes them out. The same thing in Daniel chapter 4 in verse 17 said, "The Most High ruleth in the kingdoms of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men." You know, that kind of puzzles us. In John 19 verse 11, Jesus answered, this is Jesus talking to Pilate, says, "Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." So Jesus is saying to Pilate, you have absolutely no power unless God gave it to you. Now, we know that Pilate didn't believe that, but Jesus said it nonetheless. We notice that if we read the entire Bible and the inspired words of God, many questions come to us, and of course they do. We wonder about evil rulers. You know, within our lifetime or several years even before it, we know that there were a lot of bad rulers, men that just didn't deserve to be ruling anybody, let alone maybe big parts of the world. Did God ordain these? Were their reigns established by God? Now here's something I think we have to remember. We cannot answer every question that might be raised, but we can make some observations about God and human governments. You know, people say, why did Adolf Hitler rule? Well, I don't know. Did God put him in that place? Well, it would seem to be the case, but we kind of start maybe questioning God. Well, you know, wasn't there someone better? Couldn't they have done better? Well, we have to think about some things. There's about 3 things here that I found. God instituted civil authority for the good of mankind. We know that it was. He instituted civil authority because people need it. We need people to rule us. We're social people. We get together, and we have to have someone to make sure everything gets done correctly. So, without some kind of government, the whole world would sink into chaos. You know, who's going to tell what's right and what's wrong? The form of government is preferably, or any form of government is preferably moving toward anarchy. Now, the thing that is there, that if a government is not doing what they're supposed to, then they're going to be moving toward a situation where they're doing what they want to, but not what's good for their people. We may disagree of what kind of government is best. There may be many different kinds, or we may wish to have more government or less government, whatever we may agree upon. But we can agree on this. The principle of civil authority is God ordained. There has to be someone in charge. That's the first thing. Every civil authority exists because God allows it to exist, just as we've just read. In the days past, tyrants have misused even Romans chapter 13. They say, well, I'm in power, and this Bible says that God puts everybody in power, so God put me in power. Now, for thousands of years, kings and potentates of the earth have always said that God spoke to them. God tells me what to do, and I'm going to tell you what to do. And if people didn't like that, then the God told them to kill them or something, get rid of them. The idea, though, is that many times, well, all the time, these people weren't hearing from anybody except themselves. They may have quoted from Romans 13 and said that, God has put them here and have gone into a godless agenda, something that just absolutely was not like God would have it to be. Does the fact that God institute human government mean that he approves of every government? Now we have to think about that. And we have 2 examples here that shed some light upon this. First of all, God instituted the home. God created the home. But is every home the way God would have it to be? Well, we have to say no. Here in the news today, a young child picked up a pistol from his table in the living room and shot himself, killed him. The parents had a man coming in to stay with them who evidently was a thug. He had laid the gun on the coffee table, and the young man found it. And of course, he shot himself. Now, it makes you wonder, what kind of parents with a child that size would invite someone like that into their home that they know he's got a gun? Well, the man with the gun is going to jail, and now the parents are suing the man for untimely death or something of that nature. Something, they're going to sue him for money. Well, just because God said we're going to have the home doesn't mean that all homes work the way God would have them to. Same thing, we think about the church. God instituted the church, but does that mean he approves of everything that every church does? Well, obviously not. There are many churches that are set up at the whim and fancy of somebody. And we see it every day. You know, every day you drive around and there's another sign of something you've never heard of before. The Life Church, the Happy Church, you know, all kinds of things. And we know that they're not right. But God instituted the church. We have to live and work according to his will. But some people who say church do not know what God is actually saying that they should do. So just because God set up the governments doesn't mean that every government's going to do right. God can use evil governments even to accomplish his own purposes. We see this in the Old Testament. Take Assyria, Isaiah chapter 10. Assyria was the rod of God's anger to punish Israel. God used these pagans to punish Israel. Babylonians were used by the Lord to punish Judah for their wickedness in Jeremiah chapter 25. And God used Cyrus, the Persian king, to release Judah from captivity. And that's in Isaiah and Ezra. So we can't just simply say that because God said that we're going to have civil governments that all of them are going to work the way they ought to. And again, that's so unfortunate because it confuses people. Just think of the number of people that have said to you and to me and to everybody else, if there's a church, why are there so many churches? If God said there's going to be a church, what about all the rest of these? Well, then why indeed? That's what we have to convince people. Read your Bibles. See what God says. Trying to escape the force of Paul's teaching, of course, is something that we may try to appease people with, but we always can't do it. They may say that they only have to obey good governments. The bad governments, we don't have to. But remember, the Romans in control in Paul's day. I don't think any of us would say that Roman government was actually good. Now, they had a lot of good features, but they were just full of vice and corruption. But they did some good. Let me suggest these things to us. The Roman Empire physically influenced the church. And we think, well, my goodness, why? Okay, first of this. The infrastructure of the Roman Empire played a great deal in helping the church to spread. They had a network of roads that were beyond compare with anybody, probably then or since. But it made it possible for these people on these well-built roads to get from one place to another. They spanned the empire, connecting cities and provinces, and therefore these roads were crucial to the movement of people, including missionaries, traders, travelers. The Apostle Paul, for example, used the Roman roads to travel throughout the Mediterranean to spread Christianity. The roads allow Christians to establish churches and maintain connections with those churches through the roads. The Romans had what we call the Pax Romana, and this was a period of relative peace and stability across the whole empire from 27 BC to 180 AD. That is, these people had peace. You could travel on those good roads and weren't afraid of robbers and marauders and these kind of things. People could travel safely on these roads. They could get from different parts of the empire, facilitating the exchangement of ideas. Then they had great urban cities. The Romans built great cities like Rome and Antioch, Alexandria, Carthage, all of these great places. And these cities served as cultural centers where people came to exchange ideas. And that's one of the things that was happening that was good. You know, Paul went and taught people in various places, pagan cities even, because, like the Greeks, they wanted to hear something new. Tell us something different. And of course, he had the opportunity to do that. They also had an effective system of communication. They could communicate, include the messengers, written correspondence, signal fires that allow news and ideas to spread, Christianity included. They had a great many sea routes, sea passageways, that they traveled all over the world. And this meant that Christianity could get to coastal cities, preach, and go somewhere else, particularly in the Mediterranean. Public building and spaces allowed the church to grow, had a place to meet, had a place to gather and discuss things, and therefore the church grew. And many of these structures that were pagan became Christian, because we know later in the empire that the Emperor Constantine accepted Christianity, and then Christianity was the way to go. You wanted to be the religion of your government. Then they had the military. The military had a great presence in the empire. They were everywhere. Now this meant that it facilitated, again, great travel, very, very calm, communications, and Christian missionaries were involved in preaching across the empire. Not to mention that at that particular time, Greek was the language. It was the language people spoke. That wasn't necessarily the accomplishment of the Romans. I think probably Alexander the Great was the one that spread the Greek, but that Greek was everywhere. So these preachers could go and preach in Greek, and people understood them. God has ordained our government, and therefore we strive to obey as much as we can. When we go out into the community, we obey the speed limits, we obey the traffic things, and if you don't, you could get hit. We don't, now these are just simple things. We don't hunt out of season. Government says not to. We don't catch or kill the stuff that we go hunt. Government says not to. We pay our income taxes, and that's coming up. I delivered mine, I think, Monday. We obtain a marriage license. Most people still do that, I think, even though some are common law. We don't drive without a driver's license, and we know that people do that all the time. But the idea is these things show our submission to the government. Simple things, this is what the government says. In verse 2, he says, "Whosoever therefore resisteth the power or authorities, resist the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to them damnation." Whew. Now that's pretty strict. If we resist our governments, we are going to be in trouble. Now, we have to hone in. This means we do not do what God says for us not to do. If the government says, that you can't shoot but 3 birds, then that's not a big deal. But if it says you can't worship, that is a big deal. And we know that the Christians in the first century and even beyond, they disobeyed the physical governments of the countries or kingdoms or whatever there may be, because they did what God said first. And we know that's what God approves of. That's what God says. We notice here in the New English Bible, verse 2 says, "Those who so resist have themselves to thank for their punishment they will receive." If we do something against the law, we can expect to get punished. And that's just the way it is. They're laws, and we cannot sidestep them. One who resists the law that are given in the country and by the government, which are not out of harmony with God's law, are going to be punished. And we know that there are places that you'll be punished even for obeying God's law. Thank God it's not here. But we have to listen to our governments. We notice that a woman who will not submit to her loving husband will not be pleasing to God. Ephesians chapter 5 at verse 22. "Wife, submits to your own husbands." But now we don't have to read but just a little bit further, but it tells us that husbands are to love their wives. Therefore, I'm not going to give my wife something that can't be done, shouldn't be done, just because I'm the husband. In Colossians 3 verse 18, "Wives, submit your husbands as is fitting in the Lord." The wife does not have to obey her husband if he is giving her something to do that is ungodly. Same thing for children. We know that the children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. So children are expected to obey their parents. Clark, I think, gives a good explanation. He says, as God commands it, and it is both proper and decent. I think everything that's proper and decent is suggested or told to us by God, and children ought to obey their parents because it's right. It's the right thing to do. Now, again, we know that children are abused. We know that children are hurt. And the things that their parents are telling them to do are not in commandment with God, that they shouldn't keep that. About the young boy that had been kept in his room for 20-something years, 30-something years ago, and never had been outside, I don't think. He set the house on fire so the police would get him out. They said, are you hungry? And he said, every day. The wife blamed it on her husband, but he had died about 5 years ago, so she was continuing it. It was a pitiful situation. I think he weighed 69 pounds. It was in the news, all over the news. Well, a member of the Lord's church has to submit to the scripturally appointed elders of the Lord's church. That's something else. We have to obey the government. We have to obey our church leaders, and we have to obey God as long as it's what God's pleased with. We have to continue to remember that, because that's only the way God has prescribed it. Okay, we'll start there next time, about in the middle of verse 2. Thank you so much for being here.